Hi, everyone. My name is Homer Gaines. I am a senior UI engineer for Guru. The URL is getguru.com. And I'm also the accessibility specialist on the team. Um, my career path has led me through several ins and outs of this industry. And I have been working with accessibility since what I want to say since 2001, and I recently got my certification in because I figured, this will be one other aspect of my career that I'm definitely interested in growing. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you about building accessible components and how we should actually structure these components so that we open them up and we don't create any roadblocks for any of the users that are using our applications or visiting our websites. So, I mean, we hear a lot these days about accessibility. It's a really hot topic that's in the news with companies, um, going to court because they're either fighting to not have to make their sites accessible or they are doing the work that is necessary to bring their digital properties into compliance. It's important to know that accessibility started, it came to the forefront back in 1990 when the ADA was formed. It has since become a worldwide initiative with the EU really leading the charge on this front. We have laws and regulations in roughly 70 countries around the globe that are requiring properties, whether they're private or government, to have some level of accessibility um, programmed into them, so that they actually pass the levels of the WCAG. Now, the WCAG are the standards that we use to help guide us towards building these accessible apps. Roughly 15% of the population um, has some form of a disability, and 50% roughly translates to 1 billion people globally. And if you want to just stay here in the United States, 11% of Gen X and millennials have some form of disability, but 46% of the population between the ages of 21 and 64 have a disability. So there are a lot of people that we have to consider when we are developing our applications and building the sites that we use that we want others to use as well. And often when you mention or when someone mentions disability, what we see here is what we usually picture. Someone who is deaf and they are using sign language to communicate. We picture an individual with a prosthetic. We picture someone who is blind, or we picture someone who uses a wheelchair for mobility. But it's really important to remember that not all disabilities are visible. The most common disability is cognitive. We have individuals with autism, attention deficit disorder, memory loss, PTS. All of these disabilities you can't see. You don't know unless the individual tells you that, this is what they have. So we have to be extremely careful about how we approach and limit our scope to when we are building these applications that we have. Um, Myself, I'm wearing glasses. I have low vision, but if I took my glasses off, and you wouldn't know if I had low vision or not. Another thing that we really have to keep in mind, which is, and I have to say that we are really on the edge of all of this, of all of these studies that are going on right now. But we have to worry about long COVID. So, yeah, COVID affected eh, the entire world. And so far, preliminary studies have shown that depending on the severity of a survivor's case, 20 to 70% are going to suffer or are suffering from some type of disability. I should say suffering, but they have some sort of disability that has come from them having COVID, because COVID affects respiratory, and what that ends up doing is that it affects the oxygen flow that actually goes to the brain. And so what the results have been are attention deficits, anxiety, and depression. And you may think to yourself, well, what does all that have to do with somebody using my app? Well, it plays a big part in how we use your app, how individuals actually navigate through your app. If you are designing something that has really subtle UI changes, or if you're designing forms that do not have labels, those can affect individuals with memory loss, cognitive disorders, and such. And then we also have to remember too that not all disabilities are permanent, but not all impairments are disabilities. And what I mean by this is that if you're using a device outside and the contrast of your UI is not high enough, it's very possible that glare can affect how the user sees your application or perceives your application. Um, There are also instances where you may have an injury, broken finger, sprained wrist that prevents you from being able to utilize your mouse correctly. You may need to use your keyboard more to actually navigate around an application or do the tasks that you would normally use that include a mouse. So we have to be cognizant of those issues as well. Now, coding practices, I'm going to dig into this. Roughly 1 million websites were surveyed last year. And what was found was that 98.1% of those had some form of accessibility failures. And what I like to inform um, people when I'm speaking is that it's good to get started early. And I saw this quote by Sun Tzu where he says, "Plan for what is difficult while it's easy, and do what is great while it is small." And I applied that to development because I like to inform teams that they want to shift left, that they want to start early with the development of any application that they're working on, and including accessibility in those early stages, as opposed to thinking about it towards the end, where or even after the product has launched, because now it could actually cost you more in time, money, and resources, as opposed to planning it out in the early stages and making sure that it's baked in. And then another thing is that these small incremental changes that you can make, um, such as making sure that the contrast is correct for individuals with low vision, that's not just a win for them, that's a win for everyone. So something that may seem small to you is actually a very large win for others. And as I spoke earlier, we have standards that we should actually adhere to, or these guidelines that we should follow, starting with the HTML 5.2 spec, and then also the WCAG 2.1, which actually lays out the accessibility guidelines that we should at least try to follow. And then we also have the WAI ARIA standards. And I have to caution developers on using ARIA, because it may seem like an easy win, but in reality, it could make your accessibility, worse if you use them incorrectly. Case in point, that same study that was done by WebAIM in 2020 showed that homepages that used ARIA tags had 60% more errors than those homepages that do not. And it's very possible that you've seen ARIA labels, ARIA tags, ARIA attributes in the code bases that you are working on. And what I'd like for you to do is challenge yourself and ask, is it really necessary for that ARIA attribute to actually be there. In some cases, it is because, these days we build extremely complex UIs. um, Nothing is really straightforward anymore, and that's also because we have single page apps, which is great. I mean, we're building apps with React that barely have to change the URL or the view, but we have all these different interactions that were not standardized, so we have to use ARIA labels to kind of help fill in the gaps there. But like what I'd like to say is, when you start off building your components, start with the semantics first. Start with basic HTML and CSS doing when you are building the skeleton for your component. And then, as necessary, test against the proper level that you would like for it to pass according to the WCAG. And then to fill in those gaps where your component may be falling short, that's when you want to use the ARIA labels. But it should not be the other way around. You should not use ARIA first and semantics last. And so, semantic markup, we can manage semantic markup using, like I said, using design systems, because once you build a component and you place it in the design system, that would allow the members of the other engineers on the team to grab good code as opposed to constantly recycling bad code. So, garbage in, garbage out. But if you build your components and place them in a design system for others to use, you can make sure that you have those accessibility hooks in there. You can also build the accessibility into your test so that whenever a developer does pick up a component and they start to work with it, they can make sure that they have all of the correct attributes that are actually necessary for that component to function correctly. And first, I'd like to start off talking about buttons, buttons and links. Devs confuse this a lot. The div is kind of like the holy grail. It's the Swiss Army knife of development. It can be anything. But when we use divs incorrectly, especially for interaction, what we're actually doing is limiting our accessibility from there. So, one rule I'd like for you to remember is that if you are doing anything that actually changes the URL, that should be a link. If you have interaction that is not changing the URL, it may change the way that the view is presented or any other function submitting a form, then that should be a button. And the way that we write our buttons, I'm pretty sure you can look inside your code base and you may see divs or spans that actually have interaction. Definitely don't want to do that. Spans, you can get away with it, as you see with roll button and tab index 0. What tab index does, I'll explain later. But does it work? Yes, but you still fall short in some aspects for adding the required accessibility that's necessary. Using the proper button component or button attribute is better. So button, type button, yep, that is definitely going to work. Adding your on click to the buttons will definitely work, because now you are actually assigning actionable functions to an element that actually accepts interaction. Common issues with buttons that we'll see also is when we are populating the children inside of a button. We'll see divs. Well, the problem with this is that a button is a block level element, and so is a div. And you can't have a block level element inside of a button. So the best way to approach this is to use a span. Now, this passes HTML validators, and you also don't run the risk of misinforming individuals who may be using assistive tech to navigate your site, because now it will translate as a button and function correctly as a button without you having to add anything else to it. Inputs are another one. You can go anywhere on the web and you will find forms that appear to be built correctly, because yes, you can fill them out and get through, but some forms are extremely difficult for users who use assistive tech. If you are using a screen reader, for instance, inputs that don't have labels don't communicate back to the user what they're actually supposed to type into those forms, and that can cause problems. Even when you are using your keyboard to navigate, what is the best way to actually to get through these? So with your inputs, you always want to make sure that you include a label. The best way to include this is with an explicit label, such as what I've presented here. The label sits outside of the input or above the input. You reference it with a for ID, and then on the input, you place the same ID, and that's how those two reference. Another way you could do it is using an implicit label where the label wraps the input, but this actually causes some problems with some older forms of assistive tech. So I would say, yes, it works. If you have it, it works. But if you can, update it. Images. With images, you want to make sure that you have an alt tag. You want to, because when someone is using a screen reader and they come through, what will end up happening is that the screen reader will read back the name of the image as opposed to what the image is supposed to represent. So I'm pretty sure it doesn't represent the actual meaning itself if you had some random string for your image as it was generated, but you want something that is more context based for your alt tag. So company logo here as opposed to just logo PNG. For your decorative images are meant to be hidden from assistive tech. So the best way to do those is not to just have a simple image tag without an alt tag. What you would do there is you would present an image tag with an empty alt tag, and a role equals presentation, or you can do an empty alt tag with an aria hidden equals true. And that will hide those decorative images away from screen readers, so that they don't get in the way of the individual using your application and start reporting back unnecessary uh, cues. Headings is another big issue with a lot of websites. Headers should actually be in sequential order. They are meant to structure the document and set the hierarchy of the information on the page. So what you don't want to do is have H3s, H1s, and H2s all out of order. And it's also good to remember that a page should only have one H1, but you can have multiples of the rest from H2 down to H6, but you want to make sure that they follow a sequential order. So H1, H2, H2, H3, and then if it jumps to another section, you can have an H2 there as well. Another thing you don't want to do, and designers, I would caution you with this when you're putting together your layouts, is that you don't want to use the actual element for styling purposes. What I mean by that is that some designers will use an H1 for larger headings because that's how it will natively render. Well, what that does is that it actually promotes the misuse of the header itself, because now wherever that large text is supposed to render or that large heading is supposed to render, the developer will use it there, and you will end up with headers not being in sequential order. So what I recommend is using classes to style those elements. So that way you can author your HTML correctly and then use styling or CSS to actually style the headers as they should look. Tab indexing with forms is very important. Even with navigation, it's very important not to try to override all of the tab indexing. So what you want to do here is that you want to include a tab index of 0 that will add any focusable element to the tabbing order, and a tab index of -1 will remove that element from the tabbing order. Be careful not to over engineer. It's very easy to kind of get inside your head and think that you're actually being helpful and actually end up over engineering things. I over engineered disabled buttons one time, and then come to find out I actually impacted our internationalization because the word disabled did not translate automatically when I forced it using an ARIA label to render as such. And then after you've built your component, it's always good to test. There are all plugins for all these individual browsers that we use that you can use for testing. Testing will catch roughly 20 to 57%. Well, I should say automated testing will catch 20 to 57% of your errors that may exist. But afterwards, you would definitely want to do manual testing. And manual testing comes into play where you are physically working with your machine, using your machine to actually go through your code. And the best way to do that is using the keyboard along with screen readers. Um, if you're using a Mac, VoiceOver is built into the Mac. If you're on Windows, NVDA or JAWS are great applications for you to use to help test. Manual testing, these are the different types of things that you will find. You'll test for keyboard support, tab order, focusable states, keyboard traps. You also want to test your content. You want to look for error messages that are in your forms. You want to look for alt tags. You want to look for form labels. You also want to test for color contrast and captions if you actually have video. Then also too, you want to make sure that your application actually does have screen reader support. And you want to make sure that the information that is being presented and the UI that's being presented actually communicates correctly back to the user so that they're not confused about how to use your app or to follow the next steps to get through the tasks that they are using your app for. And that's it. That's the talk. I'll be around if you have any questions. You can always reach me on the socials as well. And I'd like to thank you for listening.